Welcome back to the U.S. Navy History Podcast. I am Dale, and I'm joined by Christoph.
Hey, everybody.
By the summer of 1945, the Pacific War has been raging for more than 3.5 years. Island by island, the United States Navy and its allies had pushed westward across the Pacific. Guadalcanal, the Gilberts, the Marshalls, the Marianas, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. Each step brought the Allies closer to Japan itself. And then something happened that many Japanese civilians and even some Japanese military leaders believed would never occur. Allied battleships appeared off the coast of the Japanese home islands. Not aircraft, not submarines, but battleships. Close enough that their guns could be seen from shore.
Whoa.
This is the story of the Allied naval bombardments of Japan during WWII. It was a series of deliberate, calculated operations that brought the war directly to Japan's coastline and shattered the illusion that the home islands were untouchable. By 1945, the U.S. Navy possessed overwhelming naval superiority in the Pacific. Japan's fleet had been largely destroyed or immobilized. Fuel shortages crippled what remained. Airfields were under constant attack. Submarines strangled shipping lanes. So, why shell Japan? The reasons were strategic, psychological, and operational. Naval bombardments served 1. Destroy industrial targets unreachable or inefficient to bomb from the air. 2. Test Japanese coastal defenses. 3. Support air operations by suppressing anti-aircraft batteries. 4. Demonstrate absolute Allied dominance. 5. Undermine civilian and military morale. And lastly, Number 6, prepare for a possible invasion of the Japanese home islands. Unlike air raids, naval gunfire was personal. Battleships had to come close. They had to expose themselves. And their shells arrived without warning, screaming in from the sea. Japanese cities had already encountered devastating air raids, especially from B-29 bombers. But naval bombardment introduced a new terror. There was no air raid siren for shells fired from offshore. Civilians reported hearing a distant rumble, like thunder, and then suddenly violent explosions as 16-inch shells slammed into factories, steel mills, and rail yards. For many Japanese citizens, this was the first time they realized the enemy was right there, just beyond the horizon. The first major bombardments were planned after the capture of Okinawa, which gave the U.S. Navy forward bases close enough to Japan to operate large surface forces safely. With air superiority secured, Admiral William Hazley's 3rd Fleet and Admiral Raymond Spruance's 5th Fleet began rotating powerful task forces off the Japanese coast. These fleets included U.S. Navy fast battleships, heavy and light cruisers, destroyer screens, British Royal Navy units operating as part of the British Pacific Fleet. For the first time in history, Allied naval forces prepared to bombard the Japanese home islands themselves. The initial bombardments were not aimed at population centers for the sake of terror. They were directed at industrial facilities, particularly steel mills, ironworks, aircraft factories, rail yards, and oil storage facilities. Many of these sites were located along the coast, built there for ease of shipping and access to cooling water, which made them vulnerable to naval gunfire. The Japanese had assumed air attack was the main threat. They had not prepared extensively for sustained battleship shelling. In many coastal towns, civilians initially mistook the presence of Allied ships offshore for distant merchant traffic or even their own navy. Some Japanese coastal observers reportedly did not raise alarms until shells began falling, and by then, it was far too late. One Japanese survivor later recalled, "We thought the thunder was a storm. Then the ground erupted." Naval bombardment was not just destructive, it was symbolic. Battleships represented industrial power, technological dominance, and control of the sea. For decades, Japan had emphasized the sanctity of the homeland. The idea that foreign warships could shell Japanese factories from offshore was profoundly unsettling. This wasn't just another raid. This was the sea turning against Japan.
I never really thought about this moment in time as far as when you've got battleships sitting that close to the Japanese mainland. What feelings must have been instilled in the populace if we saw a foreign nation's major battle group off our west coast or east coast? That would be, I don't know, nerve-wracking to a degree. I think our immediate instinct is like, oh, we'll just deploy a bunch of ships and get them out of here. But after a prolonged and protracted war, that, especially when you have lack of fuel, lack of resources to help equip and get the right stuff out there to prevent what looks to be an invasion, it would be terrifying. Yeah, this, as you described the buildup, it's rough, but I'm sure the Americans, after having to fight so many arduous and really difficult battles in this island hopping campaign, the end is in sight. Like, they're really having to steel themselves, because no matter how hard the fight was on Java or Okinawa or wherever, it's going to be much harder in their homeland. And so tensions are high, and this moment is just, gosh, I can't even put my mind around the stress on both sides.
When Allied naval commanders finally gave the order to open fire on the Japanese home islands, they knew exactly what they were doing. This was not an experiment. This was not symbolic, and it was not a warning shot. It was the deliberate use of the most powerful naval guns in the world, aimed directly at Japan's industrial heart. The first major naval bombardment of Japan took place on July 14th, 1945, against the industrial city of Kamashai on the northeast coast of Honshu. Kamashai was not chosen at random. It was the home of one of Japan's most important steel works, a critical facility producing pig iron and steel for weapons, vehicles, and infrastructure. The factories were located close to the coast, making them ideal targets for naval gunfire. The Allied task force assembled for this mission was formidable. It included U.S. Navy battleships South Dakota, Indiana, and Massachusetts, accompanied by heavy cruisers and destroyers. British Navy units were also present, marking one of the first times British warships would fire directly on Japan itself. At approximately midday, the battleships closed the coast. Then the guns spoke. 16-inch shells are difficult to fully comprehend unless you've seen one. Each shell weighed roughly 2,700 pounds. It traveled miles in seconds, and when it struck, it did not simply explode, it obliterated. Observers aboard the ships described seeing entire factory buildings collapse in clouds of dust and smoke. Steel frameworks twisted, storage tanks ruptured, fire spreading rapidly. Japanese accounts describe a deep, rolling sound like continuous thunder, followed by violent concussions that shattered windows miles inland. Unlike air raids, the shells came in low, fast arcs. There was no time to flee. Within hours, Kamashi's steel production was effectively knocked out. For many American and British sailors, this was a strange experience. They were used to fighting at sea or watching aircraft disappear to the distance on bombing runs. But now they were firing directly at land, at factories they could see through binoculars. One sailor later recalled, "It felt unreal. We were used to shooting at dots on the horizon. This time you can see the buildings come apart." Another remembered the eerie quiet after each salvo, broken only by the echo of the guns and the distant fires ashore. One of the most striking aspects of the bombardments was the lack of effective Japanese response. By mid-1945, Japan's coastal defenses were largely ineffective. Heavy guns lacked fire control radar, ammunition was scarce, fuel shortages crippled mobility, and air cover was almost non-existent. In many cases, Japanese shore batteries either did not fire at all or fired sporadically with little effect. For Allied crews, this reinforced a growing realization. Japan was still dangerous, but it was no longer able to challenge Allied naval supremacy directly. Just days after that bombardment, Allied ships struck again, this time at Muroran on the southern coast of Hokkaido. Muroran was another critical industrial center, housing ironworks and steel facilities that fed Japan's war economy. On July 15th, U.S. battleships and cruisers opened fire, delivering hundreds of heavy shells into the industrial zone. Japanese post-war surveys confirmed extensive damage. Steel production halted, power systems destroyed, rail lines wrecked, storage facilities burned. For Japanese planners, this was a nightmare scenario they had never truly prepared for. Sustained, uncontested naval bombardment of the home islands. For Japanese civilians, naval bombardment was terrifying in a uniquely personal way. Air raids were terrifying, but they came from the sky, distant and unseen. Battleship shells came from the ocean, from a direction many people associated with fishing, trade, and safety. Survivors later recalled standing on hillsides and seeing flashes on the horizon, followed seconds later by explosions in their neighborhoods. One Japanese civilian later said, "We could not believe the enemy ships were so close. The sea no longer protected us." The physical damage was severe, but the psychological impact may have been even greater. The bombardments shattered several long-held beliefs: that Japan's home islands were inherently defensible, that the Navy could keep the enemy at bay, and that the war was still being fought far away. Naval gunfire made the war immediate. It told Japan, unmistakably, that Allied forces could strike anywhere, anytime, with overwhelming force. And this was only the beginning.
Yeah, I think when you were describing the differences between a naval bombardment and an airstrike or aerial bombardment, that's as soon as you hear the gun, the shell is practically there, and those shells are humongous. The World War II battleships, the shells that they were shooting, fairly accurate and devastating. And I can just imagine when you were, again, describing the ironworks just collapsing. That's got to be a symbol that the locals saw as like a, what's the word I'm looking for? It was a benefit to the war effort, and it was a source of pride. And in an instant, it was gone. And so not only do you have these enemy ships on the horizon, but something that was standing as a source of strength is gone. And all of a sudden, the feelings of defeat are looming. We had spoken previously with the psychology of the Japanese warrior and just the culture of that time, how defeat was not acceptable. You fought until you were dead. And so that was something that was in the populace as well, not just the military machine. And so I can imagine men, women, children stealing their resolve, and that this is just such a sad situation. But at the same time, I don't know. When you provoke war, it it will many times come back to your doorstep, and you got to be ready for that.
By the time the smoke cleared, one thing was unmistakably clear to both sides. The Allied navies could strike Japan at will. And they were not finished. What followed were a series of naval bombardments that expanded in scope, intensity, and coordination, including nighttime attacks and joint operations with the British Pacific Fleet. These were not isolated acts. They were part of a deliberate campaign to squeeze what remained of Japan's ability to fight. The first bombardments had answered an important question for Allied planners. Could battleships operate close to the Japanese home islands without unacceptable risk? The answer was absolutely yes. Japanese air response was minimal. Coastal guns were largely ineffective, and there were no major surface units left to challenge Allied task forces. With that knowledge, commanders saw an opportunity. Naval bombardment offered several advantages. It conserved aircraft for other missions. It struck targets resistant to incendiary bombing. It forced Japan to divert resources to coastal defense. And it applied relentless psychological pressure. So, the fleets returned. On August 9th, 1945, Kamaishi was shelled a second time. This bombardment was even heavier than the first. U.S. Navy battleships, cruisers, and destroyers once again closed to the coast and opened fire, concentrating on what remained of the steelworks and associated infrastructure. Japanese industrial surveys later concluded that whatever limited production capability remained after the July attack was effectively eliminated in August. One Japanese engineer later said, "There was nothing left to repair. The factory was gone." For the civilians who remained in the area, the return of the Allied warships confirmed their worst fears. This was not a one-time event. The sea itself had become a permanent threat. Some of the bombardments were carried out at night, which intensified their psychological impact. At night, muzzle flashes lit up the horizon. Shells arrived without warning. Fires burned uncontrollably, and confusion spread rapidly. Unlike air raids, which often had alarms and some warning, naval gunfire at night came suddenly. Many civilians did not realize what was happening until explosions tore through buildings. One Japanese survivor later recalled watching the horizon glow orange, then hearing the sky tear open. An often overlooked aspect of these is the role of the British Pacific Fleet. British battleships, including HMS King George V, operated alongside U.S. Navy units during the final months of the war. This was the first time British capital ships had fired their main guns directly at the Japanese home islands. For British sailors, this carried symbolic weight. They had fought across the Atlantic, the Mediterranean, and the Indian Ocean. Now, at the end of the war, they were present at the final act. British gunnery officers reported similar observations to their American counterparts. Little to no effective return fire, targets clearly visible, and devastating effects on industrial structures. The joint operations underscored Allied unity and demonstrated to Japan that this was not just an American war effort, but a global coalition closing in. Another significant bombardment occurred against Hitachi, a coastal industrial city northeast of Tokyo. Hitachi housed factories producing electrical equipment and components vital to Japan's war industry. Allied cruisers and destroyers shelled the area, damaging factories and infrastructure already strained by air raids and shortages. While the bombardment did not cause mass civilian casualties on the scale of air raids, It further crippled Japan's ability to manufacture and repair military equipment. Each bombardment added another weight to an already collapsing system. For the sailors firing these missions, the experience was intense but strangely anticlimactic. They were trained to expect return fire, to maneuver under threat, to fight for survival. Instead, they found themselves firing methodically at silent shorelines. One American sailor later said, "It felt like punching someone who couldn't lift their arms anymore." Another remembered the strange calm between salvos, the smell of cordite, the vibrations of the guns, and the sight of fire spreading ashore with no response. There was pride in the professionalism of the crews, but also a sense that the war was already decided. From the Japanese perspective, the bombardments reinforced a brutal reality. Japan could no longer protect its coast, defend its industry, keep the war distance from civilians. The home islands were exposed. Naval bombardment joined air raids and submarine warfare as another uncontested threat. Together, they created an inescapable sense of siege. And still, the fighting continued.
I'm just trying, as you describe this series of events, and I know it's surprising to the sailors of the Allied vessels, but I'm just trying to imagine if I was in the shoes of a civilian at night and all of a sudden, like, blasts are coming in to my coastal town that me and my family have lived in for generations. What do you do? Like, where do you hide? Obviously, there's no force that's about to repel these invaders because they have massive weapons and our weapons are not either functioning or effective. And gosh, I think I would probably flee inland. I know there's a mountainous region in Japan. Forgive me for my lack of specific Japanese geography, but this is harrowing. And it's interesting also to hear you mention the word Hitachi. I'm like, oh, I used to have a Hitachi TV. Yeah. This is wild. I don't know how to respond to this story except for just, I want to hear more about it to see how it concludes. I know ultimately how it concludes, but it's these vignettes, again, that kind of show how is the common person affected. Like, survivors, when they write about this and the ships are coming and shelling them, what are they saying? What are they thinking? What are the sailors and the officers on the ships who had fought across multiple oceans to get here and in fierce battles, and they're finally at the homeland? What are they feeling? What are they thinking? And you're doing a good job of demonstrating where everybody is and what they've had to go through, and now the final supposed engagement in preparation for what I assume everybody anticipates as a huge island invasion. And so they're just softening up kind of the defenses and everything. Please continue the story.
For Allied sailors, naval bombardment was a mission, measured in firing solutions, shell counts, and damage assessments. For Japanese civilians, it was something else entirely. It was the moment the ocean, long a source of food, trade, and identity, became a weapon. By 1945, many Japanese civilians were tragically familiar with air raids. Sirens, aircraft engines, the long, dreadful wait before bombs fell. Naval bombardment offered none of that. There were no warnings, no aircraft overhead, no gradual buildup. Just distant flashes on the horizon and then destruction. Survivors described hearing a low rumble, like a far-off storm at sea, followed seconds later by explosions that shook the ground beneath their feet. One resident said, "At first we thought it was thunder. Then the earth broke open." What disturbed civilians most was not just the damage, it was how close the enemy felt. Battleships were visible from shore, sometimes clearly, sometimes as dark silhouettes against the horizon. People could stand on hillsides and watch flashes erupt from the guns, knowing those flashes were aimed directly at them. A schoolteacher later recalled, "You could see the ships. They were not far away, It felt like the war had stepped onto our doorstep. This shattered a deeply held belief that the Japanese home islands were shielded by distance and sea power. Their belief died offshore. Many of them targeted industrial areas deliberately placed near the coast. Again, steelworks, ironworks, power stations, rail yards. But these factories were not isolated military zones. They were woven into communities. Workers lived nearby. Families lived nearby. Children walked past them every day. When shells struck, entire neighborhoods were affected. Japanese post-war surveys recorded factories collapsing, fires spreading into nearby housing, and infrastructure damage that cut off water, power, and transportation. One factory worker later said, "When the shells hit, it was not just the machines that were destroyed. It was our way of life." Nighttime shelling was especially terrifying. Without daylight, civilians could not see where the shells were landing, only the fires they left behind. Muzzle flashes lit the sea like lightning. Explosions arrived without rhythm or pattern. People ran blindly, unsure which direction was safer. A woman later recalled carrying her child through smoke-filled streets saying, "There was no sky, no sea, only fire and sound." For many civilians, naval bombardment felt more chaotic than air raids because it lacked structure or warning. Local officials were largely powerless. Air raid shelters offered limited protection against heavy naval shelling. Firefighting crews were overwhelmed. Medical services were strained beyond capacity. Even more unsettling was the inability of the Japanese military to respond. Civilians could see the ships. They could hear the guns, but they saw no effective retaliation. One elderly man later said, "We waited for our Navy to answer. It never did." That silence spoke volumes. The bombardment struck at more than buildings. They struck at confidence. For years, Japanese propaganda had emphasized naval strength and homeland defense. The appearance of Allied battleships offshore destroyed that narrative in a single afternoon. Civilians began to realize the war could not be kept away, the coast could not be defended, and the enemy was unstoppable. One survivor summed it up simply: "When the ships came, we knew the war was lost. We just did not know when it would end." Unlike the firebombing of Tokyo or the atomic bombings, naval bombardments left fewer photographs and less documentation. But the trauma remained. Survivors carried memories of the sound of shells tearing through the air, the sight of factories collapsing, and the feeling of helplessness as the sea delivered destruction. For many coastal communities, the war ended not with surrender announcements, but with the memory of battleships offshore.
Oof, that's horrible. And I guess you described in detail what I was positing earlier as far as if you saw an enemy fleet on your shoreline or your coastline and you're expecting your Navy to repel them or fight against them or something, and they don't show up, what a horribly sinking feeling that would be, and it was for these people. I know that the term kamikaze means divine wind, and I know that it was used by a lot of pilots at this time, but originally, from what I understand, it was to repel an invasion by the Mongols of Genghis Khan. When they were conquering most of Asia and they were about to cross into Japan, they were repelled twice and devastated. Like their fleet was destroyed, I think, by a typhoon, but they called it a kamikaze. And I'm wondering how many of those folks were looking for something like that to repel these invaders, because they had ultimate confidence in their Navy, which was devastating. They did a number on us, and they were a hardened enemy. But we were able to push through and deliver defeats time and time again. They had a hard time resupplying. They had a hard time developing more ships. They didn't have the industrial capacity that the U.S. had, or a couple of the other allies as well. And gosh, you don't really think about the common person in this situation in a time like this, but you really should, because that's what war is. It's just a collection of these.
While civilians on shore experienced fear and confusion, there was another side to these bombardments: the men aboard the ships who carried them out. For the U.S. Navy and the Royal Navy sailors, these missions were strange, powerful, and deeply memorable. They were not the kind of naval battles they had trained for, but they understood exactly why they were happening. Before each bombardment, crews were briefed carefully. Targets were identified: steel mills, factories, power plants, rail yards. Maps were studied, fire control solutions calculated, spotter aircraft coordinated when available. This was deliberate warfare, not random destruction. One gunnery officer later recalled, "We knew exactly what we were aiming at. These were factories feeding the war." For many sailors, the realization that they were about to fire directly on Japan itself carried emotional weight. Some had been fighting since Pearl Harbor. Others had lost friends at Guadalcanal, Leyte, Iwo Jima, or Okinawa. This felt like coming full circle. When battleships opened fire, the experience was overwhelming. A blast from a 16-inch gun shook the entire ship. Deck plates vibrated. Loose gear rattled. The smell of burnt powder filled the air. Crewmen described the sound as something you felt rather than heard. A pressure wave that went straight through your chest. Despite the violence, everything was controlled and methodical. Gunnery crews worked with practiced efficiency. Shells hoisted from magazines, powder bags loaded, breeches sealed, fire orders executed calmly. To the sailors, this was professionalism at its peak. What struck many sailors most was the lack of resistance. They had trained to expect enemy fire, coastal batteries, aircraft, torpedo boats. Instead, the shore was largely silent. A U.S. destroyer sailor later said, "It felt wrong, like someone should be shooting back." Occasionally, small caliber fire or ineffective coastal guns would respond, but it posed little threat. Allied air superiority ensured Japanese aircraft could not challenge the fleets. This absence of danger created a strange emotional conflict. Pride in dominance, mixed with an awareness that Japan was already beaten. For sailors of the British Pacific Fleet, these bombardments had special significance. Many had served throughout the war, in the Atlantic, Mediterranean, the Indian Ocean. Now they were off Japan itself, firing the Royal Navy's gun in the final act of a global conflict. British sailors later wrote of a quiet satisfaction, not triumph, but closure. One Royal Navy rating later said, "We chased this war around the world." Ending it off Japan felt final. Between firing missions, life aboard ship continued much as it always had. Mess lines formed, letters were written, watch standards rotated, damage control drills continued, yet everyone knew the war was nearing its end. Rumors circulated constantly about surrender talks, about new weapons, about invasion plans. Sailors watched the shore burn and wondered how much more destruction would be required before Japan gave up. Many sailors reflected on these bombardments with mixed emotions. They were proud of their professionalism and their role in ending the war, but they were also aware that shells were landing in cities where civilians lived. One American sailor later said, "We did our jobs, but you couldn't watch those fires without thinking about the people under them." Another put it more bluntly, "We wanted it over, however it had to end." There was a feeling among many crews that these missions were different, that they were witnessing the last chapters of the war. Ships were no longer maneuvering desperately for survival. They were delivering controlled, overwhelming force. And the sailors knew that history was being written from their decks.
You made a comment that stuck with me, and that was that they chased this war around the world, and they wanted it to end. And I had the privilege of talking to a colonel who was a POW that Japan had captured, and he was at the Alamo, and he was selling his book. And I talked to him for a while, and memories were still as fresh as the day he received them. And it was a cruel enemy, and he minced no words about how cruel his Japanese captors were and what he had to go through. And then he detailed it more in his book. And these stories weren't just coming from American intelligence, but a lot of the other nations that Japan had invaded had suffered similar fates. And the people were similarly treated, and sometimes worse. And as an enemy, Japan was strong and they were ruthless, and they would push for victory. And so, in a lot of ways, America, and that's not to even mention Iwo Jima or all these islands that had the most dreadful terrain to fight in and having to fight a relentless enemy. These guys were tired, and they did want it done. And the memories that they've had to go through and watch their buddies get killed or captured and just, okay, and that's it, they're dead. All of that is weighing on them in this moment. And so, yeah, they are, after such resistance the whole way through, I can see that this moment is bizarre because there's none of that. There's so little resistance. It's, I don't know, like a daydream, because they've been under constant threat for years. And I'm sure they just want that savagery to end. They did not want to continue receiving such brutality. And they also probably wanted revenge, maybe the appropriate word, I don't know, but for Pearl Harbor. Like, that was a lot of devastation. That was very little fighting back at the time. And a lot of our infrastructure was devastated. People were burned alive. People sank to the bottom of the harbor. And so, yeah, all these emotions weighing on these sailors as they try to finish this, knowing that even though they're pummeling the coast, it's still not going to be enough for the Japanese to surrender, and an invasion is likely. That's a lot to deal with, and it's important to remember the psychology and the historical perspective of all of this, and not just see this one little vignette on how we're just devastating a coast and everybody's helpless. But both sides fought with such strength and determination that this was a possible inevitability. You know what I mean? Like, it was going to go one way or another, and here we are.
By the summer of 1945, Japan was under pressure from every direction imaginable. The naval bombardments did not happen in isolation. They were one part of a tightening vice. And to understand their true significance, we have to look at how they fit into the broader Allied strategy. Because by the time battleships were shelling Japan's coast, the war was already closing in. Japan in mid-1945 faced four overlapping and relentless pressures. First, strategic bombing. American B-29s were destroying cities, factories, and transportation networks from the air, night after night. Second, submarine warfare. U.S. submarines had effectively strangled Japan's shipping. Oil, food, raw materials, all were scarce. Third, the naval blockade. The Imperial Japanese Navy could no longer protect its sea lanes or challenge Allied control of the Pacific. And fourth, now added, direct naval bombardment of the home islands. Together, these forces created a situation from which Japan had no realistic escape. A reasonable question is this: if Japan was already collapsing, why bother shelling it from the sea? The answer lies in certainty. Allied leaders wanted to remove any remaining capacity for resistance, industrial, military, and psychological, before considering either invasion or negotiation. Naval bombardment offered several key advantages. It destroyed heavy industrial targets resistant to incendiary bombing. It required no long-term basing ashore. It forced Japan to defend its coast with resources it no longer had, and it demonstrated overwhelming, visible dominance. And perhaps most importantly, it sent a message. There was nowhere left to hide. Japanese military leaders were keen observers of the bombardments. They understood what battleships represented, not just firepower, but industrial depth, logistics, and naval mastery. When U.S. and British battleships appeared offshore with impunity, it confirmed what many within Japan's leadership already feared. The Imperial Navy could no longer protect the homeland. Coastal defenses were ineffective, and any invasion would be supported by crushing naval gunfire. For officers who had built careers on the idea of decisive naval battles, this was devastating. The war had moved beyond their ability to influence it. Naval bombardment also exposed the limit of Japan's civil defense. Shelters designed for bombs were often useless against heavy shells. Emergency services were exhausted. Supplies were gone. Transportation networks were shattered. Each bombardment added stress to an already broken system. Japanese post-war assessments concluded that even limited naval shelling caused disproportionate disruption because it struck infrastructure already weakened by bombing and shortages. It wasn't the single blow. It was the accumulation. One of the unspoken purposes of naval bombardment was preparation for Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of Japan. Battleships would have played a central role in any landing, bombarding beaches, suppressing defenses, supporting troops ashore. The shelling of cities served as proof that this support could be delivered effectively and uncontested. In that sense, every bombardment was a rehearsal, a reminder of what awaited Japan if the war continued. The naval bombardment occurred just weeks, and in some cases days, before the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. They did not cause devastation on the same scale, but they contributed to the same conclusion. They reinforced the idea that Allied power was unlimited and unstoppable. When Japanese leaders later debated surrender, they did so against the backdrop of destroyed cities, collapsing industry, starving population, silent navy, and the battleships firing from their own shores. Naval bombardment was one more piece of evidence that resistance was futile. Unlike earlier naval wars, World War II in the Pacific did not end with a final fleet engagement. It ended with pressure, applied everywhere, all at once. Naval bombardment was part of that pressure, quiet, relentless, and impossible to stop.
I think negotiating surrender with an enemy that's surrounded by destruction seems like it would go easier, and I could understand the rationale. That's, like you said, this is why they're doing this, and ultimately that's why they felt the need to drop 2 atomic bombs. It's 'cause even after the second bomb was dropped, many in the military in Japan were still refusing to give up. Like they were like, we're not going to stop fighting. We're going to keep fighting. And that's after 2 of their cities were annihilated. And it took the emperor to say, hey, we should stop. It's okay. And what a huge intervention that was. And yeah, there's something about knowing when you're beaten and when you need to reflect and just work through the next bit. And there is something in the Japanese spirit I do admire, and that focus and that vision and that unbreakable resolve. But at what cost? Like their cities were being destroyed. They were running out of resources. They didn't have what they needed to do the job that they were determined to do. And so would we have just kept demolishing cities? Would we have dropped more atomic bombs? Would we have the invasion? All of that. I guess from a personal perspective, it's just I need to know when I need to stop going down a path that is going to be fruitless. And so likewise, I think this is that moment for them.
I can tell you there would not have been more atomic bomb droppings because we
No.
didn't have any more.
Right. It would have taken a bit to get another one, but we knew how to do it, so it could have happened, but we just ran out of the 2 that we had.
When the war ended in August 1945, the world's attention quickly shifted to surrender ceremonies, occupation, and reconstruction. The naval bombardments of Japan, dramatic as they were, slipped quietly into the background of history. Overshadowed by firebombing and atomic weapons, these operations are often remembered only in footnotes. But among naval historians, sailors, and coastal communities in Japan, their legacy remains powerful. For the U.S. Navy, the bombardments represented the cumulation of decades of naval theory. Battleships, once questioned in the age of air power, had proven they still had a role, delivering sustained, precise fire, operating close to hostile shores, supporting joint and coalition operations, and applying pressure without risking air crews. After the war, Navy analyses concluded that naval gunfire had been extremely effective against hardened industrial targets that were difficult to destroy from the air alone. For many officers, this reinforced the importance of combined arms at sea. Ships, aircraft, submarines, and logistics working together. For the Royal Navy, participation in the bombardment carried symbolic weight. British warships had been present from the opening shots of World War II to its final days. Shelling Japan's coast marked the end of a global struggle that has stretched British naval resources to their limits. Post-war British accounts describe the bombardments not with triumph, but with a sense of closure. One British officer later wrote, "We did not cheer when we fired. We knew what it meant. It was the war's last chapter." In Japan, naval bombardments occupied an uneasy place in memory. It lacked the singular horror of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It lacked the vast scale of Tokyo's firebombing. But for coastal communities, it was deeply personal. Factories destroyed meant livelihoods lost. Ports shattered meant isolation. The sight of enemy ships offshore meant helplessness. Japanese local histories from Kamashi, Muroran, and Hitachi still record the days when the sea itself delivered destruction. For survivors, the memory is often described as quiet fear. The sound of guns, the flashes on the horizon, and the realization that the war had arrived by water. Historians continue to debate the necessity of naval bombardment so late in the war. Some argue it was redundant, that Japan was already defeated. Others counter that redundancy was the point. Overwhelming pressure ensured surrender without invasion. Most modern scholars agree on several points. The bombardments were militarily effective. They accelerated industrial collapse. They demonstrated uncontested naval dominance. And they reinforced the futility of continued resistance. In that sense, naval bombardment was not about winning battles. It was about ending the war. There is another layer of legacy here. For battleships, these bombardments marked one of their last great missions. Soon after the war, aircraft carriers would dominate naval strategy. Guided missiles would replace big guns, and battleships would slowly fade from frontline service. Shelling Japan's coast was, in many ways, the battleship's final statement, proof that it still mattered, even at the very end. The lasting lesson of the bombardments is not about destruction, it is about presence. Naval power is not just the ability to fight, it is the ability to appear, to remain, and to apply pressure without being challenged. In 1945, Allied warships off Japan's coast embodied that truth completely.
It's interesting because we've had other episodes where we talk about the battleship generally, and after this point, they start dwindling in utility. Like, we don't use them very much after this, so this is the last hurrah of the battleship from the U.S. Navy perspective. And it was, gosh, what a tough fight to get to this point. You know what I mean? That campaign to cross the Pacific establish beachheads and bases and defend yourself from enemy aircraft and battleships, and then also the tactics to defeat them. Like this was a very protracted conflict, and maybe not in modern terms because we've experienced a lot of long wars since, but to be under constant pressure from end of 1941 through mid 1945, that's significant. And what a testament to the technology and just the U.S. naval spirit to get from there to here and be able to aid in the ending of this war.
By August of 1945, the guns fell silent. Not because the battleships ran out of shells, not because the fleets withdrew, but because the war itself was over. When Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender, Allied warships were still at sea, still capable of striking, still unchallenged, and still dominant. The naval bombardments of Japan had not ended the war on its own, but they helped ensure that when the end came, it came without an invasion that would have cost countless more lives. The Allied bombardments of Japan were not about spectacle. They were about inevitability. They showed in the clearest possible way that Japan had lost control of its coastline, its industry, and its destiny. The sea, once Japan's shield, had become the avenue of defeat. Battleships anchored offshore were not just weapons, they were statements. They said, "We are here, we are unopposed, and we will remain." That message mattered to military planners, to political leaders, and to civilians who could see the flashes on the horizon and knew what they meant. There's a quiet sadness to the story of these bombardments. They represent one of the last moments when big gun battleships played a decisive role in war. Soon, carriers and missiles would dominate. The thunder of 16-inch guns would fade into history. But in those final weeks of World War II, the battleship still mattered. It delivered controlled destruction. It applied pressure without warning. It stood offshore as an unmistakable symbol of power. For the sailors who served aboard these ships, it was fitting, if sobering, end to a long and brutal conflict. As historians, or armchair historians, we owe it to the past to remember both sides of this story. The sailors who fired those guns were professionals doing their duty, many of them exhausted by years of war. The civilians who lived along Japan's coast were caught in forces far beyond their control. Their homes and livelihoods shattered in the final days of a collapsing empire. History is not about choosing one memory over another. It is about understanding all of them. The Allied naval bombardments of Japan remind us of something essential about naval power and about history itself. Wars are not only decided by battles. They are decided by pressure, by logistics, by industry, by morale, and by the slow realization that resistance is no longer possible. Naval bombardment was one thread in a vast web of forces that brought World War II to an end. But it was a thread made of steel, loud, visible, and impossible to ignore. We do not tell these stories to glorify destruction, but to understand the men, the machines, and the moments that shaped the modern world. The guns that fired on Japan's coast fell silent nearly 80 years ago, but their echoes still teach us about power, responsibility, and the cost of war.
Yeah, I think that was well said. The cost of war is something that I've been thinking about every time I break down one of these vignettes of the World War II series that we've been doing recently, especially, and how there are people involved, and these people's lives are connected to families, friends, communities, and each act can snuff that life out, like whenever there's a conflict that we describe. For example, just the bombardment of the ironworks or the Hitachi infrastructure and factory. If you work there, your livelihood is gone. They can't pay you. And you're already in a devastated country. Like you're probably in one of the few places where you can reliably get money to feed your family. And now in an instant that's gone. And not only that, but your nation is on the verge of surrender and collapse, and the way of life that you've known for however many years is about to change very suddenly and very drastically. That's the human experience in these conflicts, what we dealt with at Pearl Harbor, and even in modern times. When you talk about, I was talking about with my children being able to ship replica weapons from Europe pre 9/11 with very little pushback. And they're like, yeah, okay, get it. Swords, guns, no big deal. And they're like, wow, that must have been really cool. And I was like, it was. And now we're in a different world that's radically different because of conflict. And sometimes you can recognize when that point is, that turning point that changes everything. And sometimes you don't. But certainly the allies that have been fighting as well up until this point, their worlds were turned upside down. And so it's good when you can get through the difficulties like they're experiencing in order to try to rebuild and reestablish something new and hopefully better.
At this time, we're going to honor one of our fallen angels, as we do at the end of most of our episodes. Sometimes it's not appropriate, but this time it definitely is. With the help of HeroCards.us, we are going to honor Gunner's Mate 3rd Class Paul Henry Carr. His hometown was Chicota, Oklahoma. Served with the U.S. Navy on board the USS Samuel B. Roberts, DE-413. He received a Silver Star and Purple Heart. His date of sacrifice was October 25th, 1944, killed in action in the Leyte Gulf off Samar Island in the Philippine Sea. He was 20-year-old. Born in February of 1924 to a family of sharecroppers in Chicota, Oklahoma, Paul Henry Carr was the only son among 8 sisters. He attended Chicota High School, where he excelled as a center on the football team. After working on the farm following graduation, Carr joined the United States Navy and was assigned to a destroyer escort ship, the USS Samuel B. Roberts, DE-413, in World War II's Pacific Theater. As a gunner's mate 3rd class, he led a gunnery crew that manned one of the Roberts' 5-inch mount guns. In October of 1944, Carr's ship sailed to the Philippines as part of a small flotilla, looking to protect an amphibious assault and free the islands from Japanese control. On October 25th, off the island of Samar in the Gulf of Leyte, it quickly became clear that the Japanese naval forces were much larger than U.S. Navy planners had anticipated. Before the battle began, Lieutenant Commander Robert W. Copeland announced to his crew on the Roberts, "This will be a fight against overwhelming odds from which survival cannot be expected. We will do what damage we can." Author Wilfred P. Dake in the December 1966 issue of American Heritage writes, "The overall battle for Leyte Gulf, spread across a total area twice the size of Texas, was the greatest sea fight in history. Every element of naval warfare, from submarine to aircraft, was involved. And when it was over, the Imperial Japanese Navy had ceased to exist as a fighting unit. The United States and her allies had undisputed control of the Pacific Ocean. The Samuel B. Roberts launched its torpedoes against the Imperial Japanese cruiser Chakotay, crippling the enemy's ship to protect the American escort carriers. Lieutenant Commander Copeland ordered the Roberts' 2 5-inch guns to fire on the Japanese heavy cruiser Chikuma. Gunner's Mate 3rd Class Carr and his aft gun crew fired almost all of their 325 rounds, causing extensive damage to the Chikuma's bridge and superstructure. Enemy shells then struck the Roberts, disabling one of his boilers and cutting power to Carr's gun, forcing his crew to fire manually until the gun overheated. A breech explosion resulted, killing or wounding Carr's entire crew. Though mortally wounded himself, Carr refused to leave his gun mount, trying to manually load the last shell until he succumbed to his wounds. After the order was given to abandon the Samuel B. Roberts, the ship sank into the Philippine Sea, less than 6 months after being commissioned. Of its 228 crew members, 89 were lost, but not before they played a critical role in preventing a superior Japanese force from attacking the Allied invasion fleet. The heroism and ferocity of the Samuel B. Roberts in one of the U.S. Navy's fiercest battles is legendary, and the Roberts is referred to in Navy circles as the destroyer escort that fought like a battleship. The full story of the Samuel B. Roberts is conveyed through the memoirs of Lieutenant Commander Copeland, who survived the battle and later rose to the rank of Rear Admiral, in his book, The Spirit of the Sammy B. For his bravery in the face of overwhelming odds, Gunner's Mate 3rd Class Carr was awarded the Silver Star. His citation reads, "The President of the United States of America takes pride in presenting the Silver Star posthumously to Gunner's Mate 3rd Class Paul Henry Carr, Naval Serial Number 8497679, United States Naval Reserve, for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity as gun captain of a 5-inch mount on the USS Samuel B. Roberts DE-413 in action against enemy forces off Samar Island during the Second Battle of the Philippine Sea on October 25, 1944. With the power of the rammer lost and mechanical failures in the ammunition hoist, Gunner's Mate 3rd Class Carr manned his station steadfastly in the face of continuous close-range fire of enemy guns during an attack by a numerically superior Japanese surface force on the Samuel B. Roberts. By his outstanding technical skill and courageous initiative, Gunner's Mate 3rd Class Carr was instrumental in causing rapid and heavy fire from the gun to inflict damage upon an enemy heavy cruiser. Although mortally wounded by the premature detonation of a powder charge fired by hand, Gunner's Mate 3rd Class Carr tried unassisted to load and ram the only projectile available to that mount after order to abandon ship had been given. His aggressive determination of duty reflected the highest credit upon Gunner's Mate 3rd Class Carr and the United States Naval Service. He gallantly gave his life for his country. The Oklahoma Military Hall of Fame cites Lieutenant Commander Robert W. Copeland, who wrote to Carr's wife, Goldie Lee, that Paul Carr was one of the most outstanding men. His gun was the pride of the ship's ordnance department, due not alone to his tireless energy, but due to his inspiring leadership, which shone forth like a beacon during the Battle of October 25th. Gun 2 was always the outstanding gun. That day it was superb. From any way we looked at it, Paul was the outstanding example of American inspiration and courage on board the Samuel B. Roberts that day. A courage and devotion to duty which was with him until his last breath. The Navy-guided missile USS Carr FFG 552, commissioned in July of 1985 and decommissioned in March of 2013, was named in his honor. Unfortunately, we lost Christoph during that. So on behalf of both of us, we want to thank you guys for listening. And as always, fair winds and following seas. Goodbye.